Landlord screwed with the wrong tenant for too long. This will be decently long as it needs some context. I'm going to throw in a lot of stuff to make it all easier to understand as well. I'll put where the story proper starts, in case anyone wants to skip the preamble. Minor details might not be entirely accurate as I've no interest in a revival of this conflict on any level. I won completely, and any resurrection can only taint the experience. We'll start off by noting that I spent about 2 decades working in security. During that time I worked many different types of security in many different locations. The one that matters for this story was time spent in the rental housing tribunal in a major city as a kind of bailiff. For those not knowing what that is, think a courtroom in a major city anyway. In a smaller town it'll probably be an event room in a hotel or community center, as you'd see on TV, but with less formality and an adjudicator instead of a judge. They functionally are the same thing to landlords and tenants, but they definitely aren't the same thing. This place exclusively deals with landlord and tenant disputes, and is the only place to resolve landlord and tenant disputes. Note that I wasn't a bailiff, and it wasn't a court, but these terms mostly accurately describe the situation and my place in it. For 2 years I worked at the rental housing tribunal. It was early in my time in security. I was 18-20-ish. Being as it was a major city, the sheer number of cases I sat through was beyond my ability to count. I saw everything there was to see. Noon is capable of surprising me with a story because I've seen them all. In detail, as a side duty of mine was to ensure all parties had copies of all evidence being presented. I did a lot of photocopying, and always read/inspected everything I copied to ensure nothing got cut off or made illegible. By the time I stopped working there I probably knew the way everything worked well enough to be an adjudicator myself. Well, no, obviously not, but I'm certainly in no need of a lawyer either should I ever need to go there. I also had intimate knowledge of how the system worked beyond the actual rules. Like, for example, adjudicators would always give a little leeway to anyone representing themselves over someone who had a lawyer. Or how frustrated adjudicators would get when a party was speaking out of turn. Seriously, do not do that. Skip forward almost a decade. I left the city and am in a fairly large town in the same province, same tenant laws. I have a few roommates in a decently sized townhouse. We get along well. But there's a problem. Only I can write checks, and our paydays don't line up. So I'm the one who pays the rent, and I usually can't do it on the first because roommates don't usually all pay in time. We advised the landlord we might be a day or 2 late, but we'll always have it by the 3rd at the latest. They have no problem with it at all. I spoke to them myself. For about a year this works fine. No complaints from the landlord because even if we're often a day or 2 late, we always pay. We're also fairly quiet and don't damage the property. Nearly model tenants. I do not actually have any idea why, but one day this changed. I suspect a different person in the company started overseeing the region. One day, suddenly we got a summons to the rental housing tribunal, hereafter to be referred to as RHT, on the 2nd of the month for failure to pay rent. This doesn't actually lead to a case because we paid the same day. But now we have to pay the application fee the landlord paid in order to serve the summons. I bitched to the neighbor who was also the superintendent and eventually heard back that their contact at the company was now demanding 1st of the month with no exceptions. Well, that really didn't work for us, so we probably had to pay that fee 15 to 20 times over the next 2 years. I could have gone to tribunal over it, but we were technically without a leg to stand on and I knew it. Maybe if I went enough times I can ding them for harassment, but I don't have time for that and my roommates don't care. After being split between us, all the fee wasn't enough deterrent to change our behavior, so we accepted it. If this was the only issue, there wouldn't be much story though. At around the same time, the rent leeway vanished, so did mandatory maintenance. I'm not going to list everything that went wrong and wasn't fixed. You'll get a decent idea at the end. We suffered through it. We were all working too many hours at low pay to be able to actually do anything about it. We adapted. But after about 2 years it broke. Everyone but me got up and moved out for various reasons within a 4-month period. I'm not going into any details on my roommates at all because things kinda exploded for a couple different reasons outside of this. No reason to dig any of that up. I had been saving up a while and was able to quit my job without having to immediately get another, so I suddenly had a lot of time. I didn't want to stay and pay the rent by myself or have to find new roommates I could live with, and with my experience in the RHT, I knew I had the landlord by the balls. So I went for them. I stopped paying rent. Annoyingly, I didn't get a summons the first month, but I did the second. So I went, with a meticulously documented plethora of evidence of failure to maintain the property and entering the property without formal notice. I had a copy for the landlord and a copy for the adjudicator. I know from experience that technically you're supposed to give the other party the evidence before the tribunal, but I also knew about that leeway an adjudicator gives to those who represent themselves. So I didn't give the landlord the evidence until our case came up, 100% total ambush. They argued they were ambushed, but the adjudicator just dismissed the case, dressed me down a little, and told me to file my own summons as I should have done. This was the petty revenge. The landlord and lawyer drove 3 hours to get there, for nothing. Worse than nothing. I filed my own summons, and the big day shows up. It's been about 4 months of me not paying rent at this point. I'm prepared if I lose, but I don't think I'm going to lose. The whole thing could not have gone better. I had 20 to 30 pages of evidence and 20-odd photographs. They had nothing. They had no actual defense for our water heater being out for 6 months or us not having a fridge for a year, just to mention 2 severe issues. Their entire defense rested on us being late for rent, which actually worked against them once that led to the adjudicator learning how many times we paid the application fee, and lies that had no evidence to support them. They even talked over me a few times, and I saw in his eyes the one time I opened my mouth to protest during their turn to speak but forced myself to shut up with every gram of willpower I had so only a squeak came out. The adjudicator respected me. He had no respect for the landlord. I had one on every possible front. The only question was how much. It was more than I'd ever seen. I got 9 months of free rent, and the landlord was ordered to have everything fixed before the next month was over or I'd get more. I gave notice I was leaving at the end of the 8th month and left at the end of the 9th. Because the landlord had never renewed the lease, I didn't have to give him the 3-month notice the lease specified. If you want a figure to put to it, I basically got a $13,000 judgment in my favor, adjusted for inflation and rounded. I also made the landlord and lawyer drive 3 hours, twice, only to lose. The landlord's face was so red at the end I thought he'd have a heart attack. He didn't though. By Mark. Edit to clarify a few things based on questions. I also want to add for those good landlords out there, I do feel you. My time in the RHT was eye-opening. For every bad landlord there are 10 bad tenants easily. There's a massive debate of debates to have over the whole thing. I'll only say that I do sympathize with the good landlords out there. I'm not trying to paint all landlords as terrible. This is the only landlord I've ever had that was so useless. Edit. I've revised my estimate of the ratio based on a little research and some comments from 30 tenants per landlord to 10. I'm probably still wrong, but the sheer number disparity between landlords and tenants effectively requires there be more bad tenants than bad landlords simply because there are so many more tenants than landlords. I'm going to leave it at that and just beg you not to rip me apart from either side. I'm intimately aware of the problems both good landlords and good tenants face, and my sympathy goes out to both sides. Before we jump over to story 2, please like and subscribe. That would help the channel a lot. So sue me, can do. I originally posted the story in malicious compliance, and a few were saying it would be great here and at our /nuclear revenge. I am a military veteran who was injured in Iraq. I mention only because it is important to the story. I worked for this company. I say company, but in reality it was a guy who owned a few businesses, and he was the richest person in a very small town. It's important to say how I made it to this situation. I will try and make it quick so I can get to the steak and taters as it were. I joined the military before I even completed high school, late birthdays, and all of that. I chose a military career path that I figured I would enjoy, and since I love working on things I became a mechanic. It offered a great sign-on bonus, so that was a bonus. I went through basic only ever spending money on necessities, so saved up quite a lot. Saved even more through advanced training for my MOS, military job. By the time I was done with both, I had half of my sign-on bonus and just short of an entire year's pay in my bank account. At my age most would have splurged. I invested in the stock market, Bitcoin, and paid off my parents' house. A couple of deployments, the other half of my bonus, and the only thing I really ever spent money on outside of necessities was my hot rod. Needless to say, I had some money saved up and invested it also. Long story short, when I discharged I was pretty comfortable even after a nasty divorce. Don't get me wrong, I don't have stupid money, but because of the divorces a lot of stocks were cashed out split, and if anyone follows Bitcoin over the past 2 decades you know how that turned out. After my divorce I worked to recover what I lost and then just to keep busy. Like I said, I love working as a mechanic and would bounce around wherever I felt like, since a good mechanic can make money anywhere. After a decade of this I decided to set roots in a small town since it would be nice and quiet. By this point I was tired of always working on others people's cars and wanted to devote time to working on my car. I bought a small house and saw a help wanted sign at the local lube shop. Figured it would be simple work for me and be something to cover my few expenses. I grab an application from the office, getting all kinds of looks from the townies. By the way, I am 6 feet 3 inches since I discharged from the military. I stopped cutting my hair and shaving, and I have one full sleeve. Needless to say, most people cross the street instead of walk past. When I went to turn in my application to, we will call her Sue, the bookkeeper, she asked me a couple of questions. Noticed I checked I was a veteran and puts a Y on my application. Later that day, Sue calls me and asks if I would come back in to meet the owner. Let's call him Peter. I agree, and Sue says Peter will be there in an hour, so if I come in, then we can talk about the position. I show up and Peter's eyes bulge at first sight, but we get to chatting and my southern charm wins him over. He tossed me a calendar that he had made of his car collection and asked me to name of the ones I recognized. There were a couple of Mustangs, a Ford GT, a Bricklin SV1, a Judge, a Demon, a Pantera, and a MXT. He was impressed that I knew what the SV1 was, and we chatted cars for a bit. He offered me the position and explained that I would be paid $100 a day and that I would work Monday through Saturday from 8 to 6, no overtime, but I would get a full day's pay even if we closed shop early for some reason, and eat when I could. I would be off every Sunday and one extra day during the week. Awesome start, and work maybe a year, no issues. Peter asked if I could help him out by being a relief worker for his other lube shops in neighboring towns. He says he will give me $20 every day for travel, and basically I would be covering so guys could take days off at the other stores. I agreed and did this for about a year. Then disaster strikes. Peter meets Karen and falls madly in love. In the span of a month they are married, and he starts supporting her and her gambling problem. This is when all of the problems start. One week I notice my paycheck was only $250 and ask about it. Sue tells me apparently there have been some changes and I should really speak to Peter about it. Sure, no problem. I call up Peter and ask if we can talk about some things. He shows up with Karen in tow, and when I asked why my pay was short, he tells me it was because of the bad weather and us closing early affected the business. I would have let it go at that because Peter was a nice guy, but Karen decided to speak. It isn't very fair to us to have to pay you for a full day if you don't work the full 10 hours. I said that would be true if I wasn't on a negotiated day rate, and if I get paid for each day I work, not hourly, that why I don't get paid 19 hours overtime each week. She claims that's not how it works anymore, that from now on I would be paid for the hours I worked and nothing else. Okay, whatever you say, Karen. Fast forward to the next week. We had a week's worth of very busy days where we were open a couple hours later than normal to finish up with waiting customers. And I gave up one of my days off to cover for a sick coworker. So when what should have easily been over an $800 paycheck was only $600, I had some questions. I called Peter and asked him what was going on, why I only got paid $600, and he says, well, that's what we agreed on, a $100 a day. I look at him blankly and ask if he forgot about last week, and he asked what about it. I reminded him, and he just says it is what it is. Okay, so at this point I am aggravated, and that is when Karen walks and asks, so what is he bitching about now? I look at her coldly and say, well, I worked 80 hours last week and y'all only paid me $600. She looks at me and says, you're contracted labor and you agreed to $100 per day, so why would we pay you more than that? I look at Peter and ask, is that how it is? He just says, you heard the lady. I went home and convinced myself that I was only working to cover my few living expenses. Anyway, the job isn't that hard. The only other things in this small town would have been assembling sheds or slinging chickens at a chicken plant. The next week, one of the guys I work with is getting yelled at in front of customers by Karen about what she claims is an OSHA violation. She claims that as part owner of the company, it is her responsibility to ensure that all OSHA regulations are met, and his apparent violation was him wearing tinted safety glasses. Now this is BS because the bays faced east-west, and with how the cars pulled and top workers got the sun during the day and the pit worker got it in the evening, I shake my head as I am walking in, and like a T-Rex in a dinosaur movie, it attracted Karen's attention. And she decides to shout at me, you got something to say, you big bitch, and I just kept walking. I told Sue she needed to have a long talk with Peter before Karen's mouth wrote checks he would have to cash, and she says I just keep the books, don't involve me. So this behavior goes on another year, and finally, I am at my limit. On the day I started my malicious compliance, I was in a very bad mood. I had woken up to news that a good friend of mine that was responsible for me surviving being blown up in Iraq was taken out by a drunk driver. Not wanting to deal with anyone, I tell the shop I will be working pit all day and to just let me be. These guys have been working with me a few years now and know something is up. I never once thought that this would be a day that I would need to deal with Karen, since I was working at the furthest shop from the main shop and it was in the opposite direction of the casinos. But I wasn't so lucky, or maybe I was. Peter and Karen show up and she storms into the pit and screams, Peter, come look at this mess. I have no idea what she is talking about because I always kept the pit spotless and would clean as I worked, where a lot of others would clean at the end of the day. Her complaint was about 50 of the most common oil filters we would use in a day being stacked on my waste drums for easy access to me so I wouldn't have to wait to the top guys to hand me filters. I did this all of the time and Peter knew about it and never cared before he comes down, looks around, and tells me like he is talking to a teenager, clean up this pigsty. I shake my head and say today's not the day, Peter, move on and take her with you. This apparently infuriated Karen, who of course thought it was the utmost disrespect to her and Peter, and he tells me if I don't like it I am free to leave, so I left. Now don't freak out, this story isn't over yet, that it's just the first flap of the butterfly's wings that started a massive shot storm. The next day Peter calls me and asks me to swing by the main store on my way home. I think he is going to apologize about the day before, figured one of the other guys might have told him why I was so on edge. No, that was not what this was about. Peter was calling me in to inform me that for the next 6 months I would be on a probation period for my actions, and for these 6 months I would only be paid $50 a day and I wouldn't receive the normal $20 a day I received for driving to the other shops. I ask if he is serious about this and if he has seriously considered what he was doing. This is when Peter's let his true colors shine. He tells me I am lucky I wasn't fired for my constant disrespect towards him and the co-owner Karen, how if he didn't pity me for being a struggling disabled veteran. I never once discussed my money with anyone I worked with. Why Peter thought I was broke and desperate was solely based on my appearance from what I could tell. He would have fired me long ago. Something inside me snapped and I just started laughing. He asked me what I thought was so funny and I stood to my full height, stepped to him like a drill sergeant about to give some wall-to-wall counseling and say you should reconsider your life choices and who you choose to go into business with. Peter then says, what, you gonna sue me or something? Go ahead if you think you can afford to. What do you get from the VA? Like $1,000 a month. I know how bad you need this job. That wasn't my plan, but it kicked in my malicious compliance, and since I will always be a solider to go to war. That day I called a labor lawyer, paid the $3,000 retainer, and started my lawsuit for unsafe work environment, unpaid overtime, and minimum wage violations. All while continuing to work for him. It was glorious, but still not enough. It took about the 6 months of my probation for the lawyer to get off of the paperwork together and filed slow rolling it on my request, and this lawyer was a former Marine, so I think he had an idea of what I had in mind. After everything was ready, my lawyer filed the paperwork and Peter and Karen were served at the main store while I was at work. They read the paperwork and the process server for my lawyer stuck around to be a witness to what I knew would be coming. When they read that I was suing them, Karen and Peter flipped. Peter shouts, I should kick your ass, you ungrateful piece of shit, and Karen screams, you're freaking fired, you pussy, I'd bet you weren't even really in the military. The process server recorded everything, gave it to my lawyer, who added to the lawsuit unlawful termination because it is illegal to fire an employee because they are suing you. The next day I opened up my lube shop car wash combo and started recruiting my former coworkers at higher pay plus commission. They also wanted to jump in on the lawsuit, and my lawyer was more than happy to add them to it. So 2 years down the road, after subpoenas to get security footage from the shops, the books going back 5 years, and sworn testimonies, we go to a mediation to settle. They offer a measly $50,000 to split between the 15 of us on the lawsuit, when that didn't even cover the unpaid overtime. We declined. Then our Apache came in to save the day. Sent by the IRS, delivered to my lawyer because of request for the company's tax documents. Peter held each lube shop as its own individual LLC, each with its own tax ID and employment record. Peter and Karen thought it would be a smart move to file for a tax credit for employing a veteran at each of the 6 shops. In their filing, they claimed that they employed a veteran, me, as a full-time employee working a minimum 36 hours a week at rate of $12/HR. The government gives a tax break to companies that employ veterans. At the next mediation, my lawyer presented the reports to their lawyer and the mediator, and after a quick 20-minute discussion, Peter and Karen came back and agreed to settle at our request of $400,000 in unpaid overtime to be split between 15 of us, all legal fees, and a personal settlement for the unlawful termination suit of $20,000 for each shop I was listed as an employee at, as well as unpaid wages for the 6 months I was only paid $5 an hour. Their only demand was that we all agree to a gag order so that nothing would leave the mediator's table. Of course we signed, and we took our paychecks. But somehow their tax paperwork made its way to just the right person at the IRS, and they decided to audit Peter and Karen. And an investigation was opened on them for tax fraud. I sold the shop I opened to the guys that came over and jumped in on the lawsuit. They each paid me $8,000, and I washed my hands of it. I put my house up for sale and moved away. I did go back about 8 months later because the guy who was supposed to take care of the lawn had apparently been arrested, and the yard went a few months without being cut before the city informed me that they were going to fine me $100 a day until it was brought to code, so I went down to mow it myself. While there, I decided to check in with my realtor to see if there was anything we could do about yard maintenance, and who do I see but little old Sue sitting pretty at the front desk. Sue couldn't speak fast enough to tell me what all had happened, and it was perfect. What I thought was an Apache turned out to be an atom bomb. Peter filed bankruptcy to try and not go broke after making a plea deal for probation for tax fraud and paying a ton in unpaid taxes. Karen took off with some dude she met at a casino. I asked Sue 2 questions: if she knew who reported the fraudulent tax paperwork to the IRS and what happened with Peter's car collection. She told me I have no idea, and to check the parking behind the realtor's office before leaving. On my way out, I took a peek behind the realtor's office to see a safety green SV1 sitting there. Apparently Peter started selling off his cars early and cheap, hoping he would be able to buy them back after filing bankruptcy. To this day, I have no idea who, if anyone, actually turned in the paperwork to the IRS. My personal theory is whoever was tasked with compiling it all with their claims noticed something strange and reported it. However it happened, it couldn't have happened to anyone more deserving.